All right, beautiful people. Welcome to the Stoa. Let there be light in the Stoa. Feel free to have your cameras turned on. We have Sean Waters joining us today from the Wisdom Workshop. And the Wisdom Workshop is this really cool para-academic place where Sean has these experimental philosophical workshops. Sean's definitely a fellow traveler and a fellow journaler. And he has a really cool program where they write about the good life or toward the good life. And that's the subtitle of today's session, Not Self-Authorship, Writing the Good Life. I'm going to take in Sean in a moment. He's going to, it's a mixture of presentation and workshop, and we're going to be writing. So get some kind of pen, paper, or pop up a Word document or Google document, and we're going to have some exercises throughout. And then we're going to pivot to the Q&A. So pop any questions in the chat anytime, put your hand up, little emoji. And then when we get to the Q&A, unable to establish secure connection to Zoom. I don't know what that means. Can you hear me, everyone, still? Yeah, I got a weird pop-up. Okay, cool. And if you have any questions, pop in the chat because this will be on YouTube. So if you don't want to be on YouTube, just indicate that and I'll read your question on your behalf. So that being said, Sean, I'm going to take you, hand the keys to the Stoa, and welcome, my friend. You're on mute. And
awesome. Thank you. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Stoked to be here. Before I kind of present the ideas and inquiry that this presentation led me on, I want to begin with a question. And so do collective journaling like Peter. I'm stoked to be here. This is a really cool community. And I thought to start us off, we'd start with some free writing on the following question. So we're going to go for just 2.5 minutes. Really quick. It's on this question. What is the good life? How would you define what the good life is? What's your definition of the good life? Prompt in the chat. We'll go for 2.5 minutes starting now. And ignore my assistant delete. It's about 30 seconds more. Second question, another 2.5 minutes. How do we do it? So from the noun to the verb. So our practice is how do we live this good life? There's a little bit on this one. And then this one real quick. Can you identify where your ideas of the good life have come from? So influences on what you've written, maybe inspirations might be a better way to ask this question, or maybe experiences, or where does this come from? And we're only going to go a minute this time, so I might just list names or experiences. Just a little bit to wrap this one up. So I wanted to start with this exercise for a couple different purposes. One, to kind of share what I think are some of the most fruitful philosophical questions we can ask or re-ask ourselves, and individually or with a group. Identify another way of asking the first one is what really matters to us. How are we living accordingly? And then kind of being aware situationally, contextually, where that's coming from. I'm curious if we, thanks, Peter, to maybe play a fun game with the material and the people here. Can we take about 30 seconds to put some key ideas of our ideas of the good life? So maybe boil down some of the big salient words for you. If there's any relevance, realization in your definition of the good life, and wait to hit enter so we can all see them at the same time. Maybe a couple words, 3, 6 words in the chat. When I say reveal, we'll hit enter on the chat and see what we come up with. All right, and let's go. You can let these come in. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, let's go. Regenerative aliveness is the first one that I saw. Oh my God, receiving life's darshan. That came up in my research this morning about work and worship. Values-based, fun, playful. Susan, hey, the life that you have already. Excellent. That's really good. Back to the top. Closer to organizing principles of my sphere of being. And that's powerful. Sense of alignment. Core states more often than not. Creative flow and partnership. This is amazing. Does anyone want to say anything about the experience of writing these questions before we move on to my little presentation piece of this? You can just unmute to speak if you're so called, and if not, we'll just move on.
Yeah, I'll share that. Found it incredibly difficult. I like the time constraint though, because it's like, like 10 seconds. Okay, I had really nothing. Then I popped something in, and it, felt good enough that as a starting point, and then it flowed from there. But yeah, this question, you could be, stay with it for a lifetime. So I think it's a really good one to ask.
Awesome, thanks, Peter. It's doing this to the group, and someone was like, I reject the question. you don't know what a good life is until the end of your life, right? Like, why, this is a terrible question to ask. What are we even doing this for? Like, the good life, you can't know you. And I'm like, that's what Aristotle says. Good life is only you only will really know if you've lived a good life on your deathbed. Till then, it's subject to change. She's like, oh, well, then I can be hip with that. So I just don't know what a good life is quite yet. Anything else? Any resistance, or who is this guy?
Only to what you just said. Maybe it's we only know in right now what a good life is. We can only know that now. The other thing is a comparative assessing mind.
Love that. So I raise this, and just by way of introduction to me. So my name is Sean Waters. I got a master's degree in comparative philosophy when I was making an effort to be in a rock and roll band full time in my 20s. I studied in that philosophy master's program. I studied Buddhism particularly, and wrote a thesis on comparative epistemology between Western science and Tibetan Buddhist approaches to mental well-being. So my question was, and what the question that still animates me as someone that is into philosophy is like comparative study and comparative religious studies, is how many different ways there are, culturally and otherwise, to frame this really big question. What is a good life? Human flourishing, how do we think of it? What are the metaphors we use? Is it a garden? Is it a meal at a table? Is it a flow of growth, seasonal growth? Is it the elimination of desires we don't need, Epicureanism? Is it the cultivation of character traits that will enable us to flourish, Aristotelianism? Is it the cultivation of virtues that are strengthened regardless of what happens outside of us that we can't control, Stoicism? Is it, and props to Peter for doing this. Or if we go over maybe, to the more Eastern orientation, is it connecting, communing with our nature, that is my nature and no one else's? We're reminded, we had a Taoist master in one of my classes, and he said, his English was limited, but I remember this so well. He said, my Tao is not your Tao. Your Tao is not my Tao. How can my Tao teach you your Tao? How can your Tao teach me my Tao? To practice Taoism, one must become dummier and dummier. And I remember that because that frames a lot of what we're doing with the Wisdom Workshop, and then what I hope to make clear. I'm definitely not here to proselytize or impose my Tao on anyone else's Tao, but that's another definition of a good life. Tao. If we go Confucianism, more Confucian, there's a social element. Good life is performing the tasks that we have a unique role to perform, to create communities and societies that reinforce the individual's ability to be with the community. And where we're going to land, what's interesting to me is the Buddhist idea, where I focused of not self, or anatta, or anatman, this idea that there is not a solid, permanent, existing self. And instead, what we take to be a self is actually this radically impermanent, interconnected, dynamic, karmic process of choice and unfolding. So I might see, and this is where, when I was talking with Peter about the session, my tension with self-authorship programs and self-actualization coaching, there's kind of a rub for me here. Is what is the self we're actualizing? What is the self we're authoring? And if we're doing workshops on living a good life, what does that actually mean? How do we make space for everyone in that kind of inquiry? And that's kind of what I was hoping our discussion would be about today, is one, this idea of not self broadly conceived, that not only who I take myself to be, but who I am actually, if we go along this line of thought, is a collection, a sequence, a series of decisions, conditions, feelings, thoughts, might also say like an ecology of practices. So who is Sean Waters? He is this, I don't know, actually. It's almost more complex than I don't want to say. But I know he's in process, and I know he's interconnected with other things. I know he's stoked to be here and hopefully riding that excitement for collective good. So I'm going to say, I guess my thesis, to just jump right to the point, is that I do think, in my experience, and the idea I want to share with us is embracing this idea of radical impermanence and interconnectedness, seeing where self-authorship, seeing where not self, being this idea of not self connects with more contemporary ideas of self-authorship, I hope affords us some neat moves in thinking about what it means to live our version of a good life. I'm feeling called to stop here to see if anyone has anything they want to say or questions about this framing. And again, just feel free to unmute if you feel like you want to say something. Okay, so just a basic of, do we get the basic idea of not self? Instead of we could say not self in a very, to paraphrase, I'm dropping his name. The name is dropping from what I identify as my mind. Not self is basically, we could say, thoughts without a thinker. Also how kind of the practices of meditation, mindfulness work as you're cultivating new thoughts in a certain regard. Self-actualization is this process of actualization, we might say, is this process of expanding our capacity. I'm going to put freedom, although I don't like this. At the same time, it might also be expanding our capacity for authentic becoming. I know you, Peter, you had the Hans Georg Mueller, the guy that was talking about different notions of authenticity versus profilicity and sincerity. So these terms aren't neutral, I guess is what I'm saying. They're situated in a historical context that may or may not be helpful for our personal authentic becoming, whatever that is. But basically, you could say it goes from a real basic overview, and I'll put this in the chat for people's reference. And this is going to be a big one. Sorry, you could say the first stage of self-authorship is following formulas, the external definitions of things. In this initial stage, individuals tend to rely on external authorities, such as parents, teachers, or cultural norms that define their beliefs, values, goals, influenced by expectations of others and often conform to societal norms. This theory of self-actualization we could link to partially humanistic psychology, but also Marcia Baxter Magolda in the late 20th and early 21st century, someone I don't know. Then we kind of get to some kind of crossroads. There's exploration and transition. As we gain more life experience and are exposed to more diverse perspectives, we may begin to question the beliefs and values we've adopted. We enter this self-authorship stage where we come to an internal definition. So my definition of myself and my world and my experience is no longer just given to me from the outside, something that I author, write for myself, live according to that. And then lastly, we build on that internal foundation with integration and refinement. Keyword in emerging psychedelic therapies is integration, right? Once we have these peak experiences, what do we do with them? How do we integrate them into the rest of our life? How do we take an internal definition that makes a lot of sense to be my Tao and move that into actualization on a day-to-day basis? It's interesting when I ask them the next question, and there's just kind of two more questions here. The next one is, how does this connect to not self? How does self-authorship, this idea of going from external definitions to having a crossroads or questioning to an internal definition and then a refinement of our internal definition, So how does this notion of self-authorship connect to the Buddhist idea of not self? And this was fun to look at because there's some interesting differences and comparisons. One, at a level of focus, self-authorship is focused on ourselves. Not self, on the other hand, is focused on everything that is not us, or at least our capacity to practice compassion, loving kindness, equanimity, sympathetic joy, which in Buddhism are the four immeasurable states or heavenly states that have a really big, powerful karmic impact and lead to, more awakened states of being. So we could say there's a difference in focus. One of them is focused on ourselves, self-authorship, and one of them is focused on how we interact with other people in a community as being with compassion, love, so on and so forth. But what I found from my research, it was so cool, is that this is basically both of them point to a malleable or flexible, resilient sense of self. So in both cases, either self-authorship or not self, we have this notion that the self is flexible and dynamic. This clearly connects to contemporary theories of adult development. If we're cool to Robert Keegan's work of the self-transforming self, or this higher level of adult development, where we have the capacity to see ourselves as a transforming self, that's what the self is. It's this perpetual transforming. For example, connects to Erik Erikson's theory of psychosocial development, other theories of ego development, that we end up loosening the grip on ourselves. And I guess where we're going to end is, what do we do with this? What is wisdom in this context? Since we are, and we'll go for another 4 minutes and then go to discussion. What is wisdom in this context? And thanks, Peter, for what you're doing. You could say one definition is to be less foolish. Pretty good one, identifying what foolishness is and getting rid of it. The definition I've been using that I like is our capacity to make choices that matter, our ability to choose well in an existential sense. And that could be about the depth or breadth of our experience. But it includes this kind of skillful being. So you could say wisdom is about skillfully engaging our understanding of what the good life is, our understanding of what we as selves are or not selves, and how that relates to our body or ecology of practice. And that, my friends, is pretty much the punchline, except that what we've been doing in the Wisdom Workshop, to just share a little bit more about my work and why I'm excited about it, is creating these interpersonal spaces where we can kind of workshop wisdom together. What does it mean to actually, is wisdom something we can workshop? What kinds of people would we need to be engaged in if we're doing this Socratic kind of dialogue? And there is a lot of people doing like circling practice or other modes of interpersonal contemplation and practice of mindfulness, compassion, sympathetic joy, equanimity in groups, right? But for I wanted to create the onset of the pandemic personal existential crisis led to me reevaluating both my work as a musician, artist, and as a teacher. And I was finding it harder and harder to do what I wanted to do in college classrooms. I teach at Colorado State University as my day job in the English department. And I wanted to create something that I wanted to take, I wanted to create the course that I wanted to take around this question of what do I most want to teach that is also what I most want to learn? And what's come out of that was in 2021, was this increasing inquiry on group dynamics and our capacity to influence each other in a interpersonal space, not by shoulding on each other. We have an agreement, I won't should on you if you don't should on me, but by listening, reflecting, inquiring, and exploring ideally how these different foundations of living a good life, how they're playing out in real time. So this part kind of, because this isn't emergent, if we take the idea of not self to heart, the self, what we take to be my life, is an emergent, co-constructed, flexible process that can modify based on the inputs, conditions, circumstances. The garden, the idea of an Epicurean garden is wonderful here, that I grow, the friends that I curate, and that kind of a thing. So we, created that exploration of what are the foundational aspects of the good life across world traditions. And in philosophy, we got a sense of presence. I think a lot of pictures of living a good life. And for me, I think if we're living a good life, but we're not present to it, that's not a good life at all. So mindful presence for me has to be a part of it. Sense of purpose and meaning would be the second kind of aspect of a good life. A sense of play, exploration, synchronicity, emergence, a sense of projects, doing projects of worth. 4, 5 would be people, our relationships. 6 would be partnerships, our deepening relationships with people connected to projects of worth. And then finally, perspective, which is these glasses are just a prop, or they're my way of pointing to the fact that we're seeing the world through lenses, and that part of the work of wisdom is how we see as our perceptual moves. And that concludes the presentation section of this. I'm hoping there's some questions that come up, and it feels like I'm at the beginning of this inquiry. Basically, how can we rethink adult education for more wisdom, the cultivation of the factors of wisdom? I'm doing a lot of research and writing and thinking on that, and I'd love any feedback, references, anything like that is really neat for me personally. So if this is making you think of anything, I'd love to hear it.
So one of the things that I started when you talking about no self, I was thinking, does no self just mean that just as a reminder that I'm always developing, that I in fact do have a self, but I just don't get too attached to yourself? Or does it mean more than that, right? Like, is it just that be ready to grow? Or is it that, or is there something else? But then the two of the things that you put up made me think maybe they're connected. One is the thing that says plans are worthless, planning is priceless. I was like, wow, that's pretty cool. And then connecting that to self-authorship and the Buddhist idea of no self. And I was thinking, well, I guess, in some ways, self-authorship is almost like planning, right? Like, because if I'm writing down what is a good life, where am I getting that good life coming from? I'm sort of thinking about that both forward and backwards. And so there's some planning related to that. But then once you make that plan, like this is a good life, it's hard to sort of keep that in your mind from moment to moment. Rather, you should forget it in the moment and be a part of the context and let the world and you sort of interact and create yourself in the moment. So the no self is more a momentary thing versus the self-authorship is more planning in the background. So this is what I sort of came to. I just want to share.
That's really helpful for me, Ben. Just the kind of static and dynamic aspects of this. I appreciate that. That's cool. Peter, do you have any questions or reflections on the ideas?
Yeah. Well, one thing staying with me is the tension, the kind of self-authorship, and then the idea of not self. And it's like when I'm journaling or writing, or I feel like really in the flow of something, it's like it feels like I am authoring my life via each word, one word at a time. Then I also get in this transpersonal state when I'm the best of when I'm doing the best journaling. So it feels like there's that kind of honoring both perspectives when I'm in that state, because I can't tell which is which. And then the other thing, the book I'm reading, I sent you, The Ignorant Schoolmaster, and how instead of having that top-down authority figure teaching it, the kind of like you can teach from a place of ignorance, or at least that's the argument of the book. And I think that's such a cool, like, wisdom is such like ripe to use that ignorant schoolmaster approach.
Yes.
And I think that if we're going to like teach wisdom or teach less foolishness, it has to be this sort of way that you're gesturing at.
It's beautiful. There's a question, another thing I want to highlight, that I think in terms of how I see philosophy as a pragmatist, I'm not sure. This is kind of also revealing my Buddhist leanings. There's a great story about a Buddhist story about someone's walking along a path and they see someone with an arrow in their back, and they're like, "Oh, you got an arrow in your back." The person's like, "Yeah, it sucks. Can you help me get it out?" And the person's like, "Yeah, sure. There you go. Just hold still. Hold on." Person with the arrow in the back is like, "Wait, before you do that, can you tell me what kind of an arrow is it?" Person's like, "I don't know. It's looks wood. What kind of wood?" I'm hickory. I'm not sure. Just hold still. Is there feathers on the back of it? Well, yeah. I get. I'm not, just hold on. I'm just trying to pull the arrow out. Point of the story. Some questions don't help us remove the arrows out of our back. And I'm worried, like when you present something like self or not self, especially a question that's kind of the core of our like identities. I want to make a distinction between like abstract philosophizing about whether or not we actually have a self versus kind of pragmatic application, seeing. And I'd imagine for different people on this call, different mixes or different ways of thinking about the self are going to be more beneficial to pull the proverbial arrow out of our back or to grow a better Epicurean garden. So I just want to represent the kind of pragmatic focus of the work, is not to argue about whether or not we have a self or not, or whether or not self-authorship is a better framework than not self, Buddhist not self, but potentially like as frameworks, lenses to approach our unfolding. That makes sense? Trying to be as ignorant and unknowing as possible, following Peter's nod to the ignorant schoolmaster.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. I mean, you bring up a classic situation of absolute and relative and no self and everything, and we're all here as expressions of no self. And I really appreciate the way Ben put it a little bit earlier, that it's just a matter of timing and focus of which one's up front. Peter, when you're journaling and you reach that transpersonal state, it's there, but when you hit the send button on the email, then yourself's there, and creating the Stoa. So it's beautiful to include both and acknowledge both.
Yeah, I love that. I just the idea that self could be situational as well. And with equanimity and mindfulness, when the ego is like, "Oh yeah, way to go. Good job, ego. Way to serve your protective function. That's enough now." You could go on a walk. It's funny. And I wonder, I mean, I guess the other piece of this is what we end up doing with this. If it is something that we can do, what we can do with it. And I think it's interesting to me that in the factors of awakening in Buddhism are these four immeasurable states, or four heavenly states as they're translated. Each have this element of not self to them. The equanimity, first and foremost, is kind of mindful, not judging of whether or not something's good or bad. So when the ego comes back up, It's, we can be mindfully aware or have equanimity towards that, which is also a big idea in Stoicism, obviously. But also sympathetic joy, to experience another's joy as our own. And compassion, which is interesting. A heavenly state is to feel another's pain as our own, or to be with another's pain. And loving kindness, the sense of like doing what we can for other people, extending ourselves in some kind of way. I think this is a really cool. I just feel like the other place I thought about landing this is, one definition of the good life is helping other people live a good life. That the good life, a good life is more about, or at least a surefire way to live a good life ourselves, this kind of smart selfishness, is to help other people live a good life, whatever that is for them. So in that case, I think doing these kinds of things, I hope, gathering people together to discuss and then consider how we might apply these ideas is, I think, a big part of what I see education as, or at least a higher education that is too absent from the university classes and university culture that I'm in, hence needing to start a extra academic teaching practice.
If I may, it's
Please.
amazing. It's amazing what I'm hearing, because for the past week and a little bit here with the Stoa, I've been journaling, because I'm a farmer and I own a farm, and I've named the different blocks after the 4 heavenly abodes. And it's my process right now of journaling on how to communicate to others through education of farming, like what you need to bring to farming. You need to bring the equanimity, because you don't know what harvest is going to be like, if you're going to get a harvest. You have to bring the sympathy and understanding of the plants and these sessile sentient beings that are standing there in all 4 seasons, and have compassion for them. And so it's just such a confluence of events, and really appreciate you being here and you hosting, Peter, and this is a great topic.
Thanks, Stephen.
Go ahead. I have a share, but I think Ellen wanted to share something earlier.
Yeah, I'll say, go ahead, Ellen, please.
Oh, no, you go ahead. It's all right.
It reminds me that we have a kind of a joke that, and it's not a joke, but to not get mad at the lettuce, the farming idea that if you're growing lettuce and the lettuce isn't growing, it would be foolish to get mad at the lettuce, right? We all in agreement there. What do we do instead? If it's foolish to get mad at the lettuce that isn't growing, what do we do?
We have compassion for the lettuce.
And hopefully that entails doing some things also.
Right, empathy, and then loving kindness.
And how do we do that with some lettuce?
Ask the farmer.
Yeah. So Stephen, yeah, we might water the lettuce. We might go and see, like, are you too dry, lettuce? Do you have too much water, lettuce?
Yeah, I often talk about it in the sense that I'm cultivating the conditions for their success and thriving, and through real careful observation and respectful pruning, and just recognizing their potential to be what they are, and trying to create the conditions accordingly.
And so you basically make sure it has enough sunlight, water, nutrients, the conditions it needs to thrive. Mm-hmm. This is from Thich Nhat Hanh. He says, this is how we should treat ourselves as well. Except when we notice that we're not growing, a lot of our go-to reaction is to get mad at ourselves. We wouldn't do that for lettuce. We just imagine that if lettuce has the conditions it needs to thrive, it will thrive. Likewise, if we're not feeling well, instead of, we can use this kind of not self-wisdom to see if we need a rest or a sandwich or some water or some tea, just like the lettuce. So I just wanted to make that connection with hashtag lettuce time. which is shorthand for, like taking care of the conditions we need to do well, rather than like focusing on pressuring ourselves to have the will to do what change needs to, we can. So yeah, Ellen, if you're
Are you inviting me? Was it Ellen or Ellen?
Ellen,
Sorry,
yeah,
I'm
I
not
am.
seeing-
I think
Okay,
so.
okay,
I think
great.
I am inviting you.
Yeah, I really appreciate this inquiry, and I do see the value of it in terms of higher education, in terms of any type of education. And I've been looking again anew from this place of not knowing what no self means to me. And in relation to this, the beauty of it for me is the flexibility of consciousness to be able to see outside of, you bringing up equanimity, outside of the identity that has to hold to itself, the flexibility to shift the focal point from this me that needs it this way, or that needs the lettuce to grow in a certain way, to the capacity to be curious, the capacity to be able to meet outside of that limited self me, and to expand the concept of self to include all of life around us, to kind of get out of that level of development of developing a healthy me. I mean, to move beyond it into being able to recognize the we as part of that me, and then the other forms of life, the winged, the fin, the four-legged, all that grows as part of that. And that feels really antecedent to a healthy planet, to being able to be open to emergence, and to be able to keep coming back to that openness, to keep checking in, to keep curious, to keep alive and awake. Like, what's this now? Like, I've written about no self, but it's like, what does that even mean? It started not to me. It was like, wait a minute, it only means something to people who have a strong sense of self. Then it's liberating. But then after that, it's like inclusive. It's ever more inclusive of that idiosyncratic me, that idiosyncratic self. So, yeah. Excuse me, I'm walking, so I'm not keeping visual contact with all of you. And I hope I'm connecting.
Maybe you're so eloquent and profound because you are walking, and that's putting you in a greater state of connection with the body and nature.
Thank you.
And just the idea is really, really powerful, that not self actually would include, by definition, the self. That would be part of the not self. Just so that's really fascinating and powerful how you framed that. I had not seen that before.
Yeah, there's no division. There's a capacity for recognizing, for
Yes.
realizing the absence of division, while still being able to maintain the capacity to recognize and discern differences.
Yes. That's so powerful, Ellen, too, because one, you use the word discern, which has been my accidental watchword for the year. Two, we've been in a wisdom workshop group discussing Ubuntu. This idea is an African word of basically I am because we are. It's a notion of community, that who I am exists because of who we are together. So there isn't like the notion of a solitary human being just doesn't make sense in that term. So, and why I'm saying that is what you said, difference and not division. That was one of the definitions of Ubuntu, is the differences between us are one of the ways that we can understand what each of us has to provide to the I am because we are community. And that again points to the idea that if we talk with each other openly, transparently, curiously, lively, awakely, maybe Peter's experience is going to cast a light on mine in some interesting way, and vice versa. Or your description, Ellen, did do that for me in a way. There was a flash of insight for me that I hadn't gotten alone.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you. It's good.
I have a comment. So the philosopher Foucault has something he calls technologies of the self. And I think in his essay, he uses like both Stoic, like journaling, and then also some type of like Christian, I don't know, prayer recitation or Bible verse, something, I don't remember. But the point of it is like, there are technologies you use to, like, I guess it's basically a kind of self-authorship, like the way you use these technologies, whether it's writing or whatever, is kind of like acts in creating yourself. So that kind of begs the question, like, what is the technology of the not self? And I'm gonna say this quote that Peter shared the other day in collective journaling. It's by Eugene T. Gendlin. What is true is already so. Owning up to it doesn't make it worse. Not being open about it doesn't make it go away. And because it's true, it is what it is there to be interacted with. Anything untrue isn't there to be lived. People can stand what is true, for they're already enduring it. So that, I think I want to make a connection between the truth, like it is there to be interacted with. So maybe like by doing self-authorship with others, it's like you're presenting a version of yourself, and then that's there to be interacted with like a collective or a community. And it's like, yeah, the iteration between self, this is who I am, and then not self, like a community kind of reflecting back at you, and then your self changes, you have a new self, you author it, and the cycle continues.
I love that you said iterations, Kevin. That idea and the whole, I'm definitely going to look into Foucault's concept of technologies of the self and how that connects. It's rad. So it does, I feel like there's an experimental thing of this for me. Maybe again, this is my pragmatism showing, but that kind of idea of experiment and experience, where our experiences are a kind of experiment to in this kind of interconnectedness. Time for a few more comments or questions or glorious rebellions to anything that you said.
I'm working on a post on my Substack, which I'll probably release on Saturday, and I'm calling it "Based Definitions, Philosophical Practice." And we were talking about kind of like definitions, Sean, last time we spoke. And they're carved up in the critical thinking literature. They're carved up in different way, like intentional, extensional. But when it comes to origin, one of the ways it's carved up is lexical dictionary or lexical definitions, which come from a dictionary or from others, and then stipulative definitions is which comes from others, and they kind of like demand you use the word in the way that they're defining it. And so there's that pressure. And I'm going to make an argument that there should be a third category for origin, and that's based definitions. It comes from source, or it comes from something kind of like transpersonal. And then like that Glenlin's felt sense kind of method of thinking at the edge, where I'm going to like reference that as a practice. And And in the kind of the recommendation part in this piece, I'm like, pick a word like that's core to a lot of people's philosophies, like, you know, love or truth or wisdom, and then like source a definition from it, one that kind of resonates. And it seems like that's kind of similar thing that you're doing with the good life. It's like a super high leverage term that a lot of people probably just take for granted and is borrowed from the culture. And not something that's kind of like sourced in a way that feels really resonant. So I'm curious if there's other like phrases that you think are really good to use in this process, like the good life, that you've been experimenting with or you're called to experiment with.
Great question. I think fulfillment is an interesting one. We have order fulfillment now, which is like, you know, more of like a consumerist bent on that, but like personal fulfillment's an interesting one. What does it mean to be fulfilled in this context? Flourishing is another good one. Just kind of what is human flourishing? It's kind of good life may be seen as a shorthand for that. Well-being. What does it mean to exist well or skillfully? And happiness is another good one. But happiness is also, you know, one of the problems that keeps us from being happy is trying to be so happy, kind of thing. So I don't know about that one. Thank you. I'm also curious, I mean, what else? Yeah, purpose is another really good one. Curious if there's any other connections, Peter, from, I know we talked about Ron Lahav and the kind of deep philosophy of reflecting and doing philosophy with other people. I'm curious if there is any other like connections that people are seeing that they want to presence. And then I think it's interesting to kind of close. We'll see if Peter wants to do, before Peter's closing ceremony, if he wants to do one. There's room for another inquiry about what we're going to do with this session. Another way of framing this is, if we were in a liminal space in this workshop where there was a before this workshop and an after this workshop, and when this Zoom session ends, we're going to enter into the rest of our lives, potentially as a subtly different self. What does that look like? What's the entering into the new iteration of ourself? Are there practices or commitments that this community is allowing us to make that we wouldn't have been able to make otherwise? Might be worth having some real space to reflect on that, maybe a minute and a half. I want to thank everyone for coming, hanging out. This is, yeah. Yeah, if you feel like you want to say what you're going to say what you're going to do to the group, that can be a powerful way of affirming your new identity. And thank you, Ben. I love that you presenced how both of these went together right at the onset of our discussion. I think that did a lot of great work for everyone. For me, at least. Yes. On that note, Daniel, freaking cool. I'm going to share a copy of the, a Google document of conversation I had with ChatGPT to after this conversation about different philosophical schools' notion of the good life, Buddhist philosophy of not self, how it connects to self-authorship, and then how that connects to theories of adult development. So you can kind of get a sense of how I've been using that in case that's, and that link is in direct response to Daniel. Clarify philosophical schools. You might also, Daniel, this book, How to Live a Good Life, is one of the ones we've been looking at. It's and I can put that in the chat. It's edited by Pigliucci, Cleary, and Kaufman, and I like it because it's a series of essays written by people who embody certain philosophies. So a Taoist writes the Taoism chapter, Epicurean writes the Epicurean chapter. Pigliucci is a Stoic kind of scholar of Stoicism, and not all the chapters are as good as each other, but not the Epicurean chapter, the Aristotelian chapter, the Taoism chapter are all, the Buddhist chapter is really good. Owen Flanagan, I think, does that one. Yeah, it is Owen Flanagan. So that one is, if you want to, I think that's a good
Super.
book.
Thank you very much, Sean. I
Yeah,
have a
man.
problem with my camera and stopped working.
No worries. How to Live a Good Life edited by Massimo Pigliucci et al. Others. Yeah, Peter's a man. Turn it back to you, Peter. Tag, you're it. Thanks, everybody.
Awesome. Thank you, Sean. And just so I got any place you would recommend people do your work? Sure, awesome. Daniel.
I'd say, if you want to, I love one-on-one kind of exploratory conversations to see where, just learn from each other and see whether or not what we're doing upcoming, since it's changing all the time, whether or not where you are is a good fit for where it is. And it is, this website is still under revision. I was hoping to get a more substantial revision done by today, but it's still, that's just wisdomworkshop.io. Use the IO extension to point that this is a kind of technology of growth, which is also why, Kevin, I geeked out about your reference to Foucault, because I had not thought of that.
Very cool. Yeah, definitely check out Sean's work. I always get excited and inspired when I meet a fellow traveler, because when I first encountered Sean, it's like he was on a totally different like ecosystem from all the stuff that I was playing with. Well, not totally, but kind of like running a little bit parallel. And I really like this project of emancipating philosophy and getting it relevant to people, everyday people's life. And I think that's what both Sean and I are doing in our own way. And there's a bunch of sessions coming up. One that Sean might be interested in, and people who are interested in this session, the end of history, an argument against studying the history of philosophy. So there's this philosopher, he wrote this kind of controversial paper, The End of History, and he said that we don't need to learn the history of philosophy, because if like as Sean knows, a lot of academic philosophy is just like learning with like historically a lot of people said, but do you really need to do that and engage in really deep philosophical inquiry? And most of my in conversations that we don't talk about the history of philosophy or even mention different philosophers. So feel free to check out that session and more sessions at the Stoa.ca. So that being said, Sean, everyone, thank you so much for coming to Stoa today.
Thanks, everybody. Free to reach out. Appreciate y'all.
Thank you. Very
Bye.
encouraging. The whole